Unbeknownst to Chris and probably to most of you, the London chapter board d voted and determined that this lecture will be the first lecture in honor and recognition of Chris Ellis's service and contributions to the London chapter. Chris has been a member of the chapter and contributing to the chapter for over 40 years, or almost, yeah, almost over 40 years, trying to keep track of it. He has been served in almost every role on the board possible, as president, vice president, treasurer. I don't think he's been secretary, but I could be wrong. He's been the Kiwa editor. He's held all kinds of roles. Um, his dedication to the chapter and to the OAS is just unparalleled. He's already been given some amazing awards for his service: the Tim and Ian Kenyon Award from the OAS in 2012, the Smith Wintenberg Award in 2017, and the J.V. Wright Lifetime Achievement Award in 2018. Um, Beyond work doing stuff for the chapter, he also served as an editor for Ontario Archaeology. And in recognition of Chris's interest and contributions to paleo and archaic period archaeology, the lecture will feature research related to these time periods every year. Um, so we voted unanimously. This special annual lecture is a show of our appreciation for your service, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. Most unexpected.
You are quite welcome.
Although I do like lectures on Paleo-Indian archaic material.
I figured you would. All right, without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Potter from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. He has spent over 20 years working in Beringia, essentially Alaska, looking at anthropological archaeology, looking at sites throughout there. He has some incredible research looking at paleogenetics and climate adaptations and a whole bunch of different stuff that will be featured in his talk tonight, so I won't go on. I've heard him speak before. His talks are always very interesting, and I am looking forward to tonight's lecture. So I will stop my screen share and pass it on to Ben.
Awesome. All right, so good evening, folks. I guess it's evening time there, still a little bit afternoon here in Alaska. I definitely appreciate everybody being here for the talk. I definitely want to thank Chris Kearns for inviting me and the Ontario Archaeological Society for sponsoring this. I'm always excited to talk about this. I think there's going to be hopefully some robust questioning and interactions because it's a really phenomenal topic I'm super interested in. I don't know how many have seen this illustration, I guess, before. We made it on the cover of Science Advances for our recent article on Anzac, and this was a collaborative endeavor between me and the artist Eric Carlson, largely based on the Laprelle site in Wyoming, but the juvenile mammoth butchery was based on Swan Point, which I'll talk about a little bit later here in Alaska. So it'll be wide-ranging tonight. We'll move from the Baikal area all the way to South America. But it'll be fun. Lots of data, though. Okay, certainly there seems to be much debate, I think maybe more than the data necessarily entail about the peopling of the Americas. But I do believe that the genetic data, the archaeological data are coalescing in ways that make sense, and ways that make sense, I think, with the bulk of the archaeological data. And I hope to sort of show you guys that today, but also provide a model. And it's just one model. There can be many models. As the old adage goes, all models are wrong, but some of them might be useful. I appreciate that tack. So I'll provide one model of potential peopling of the Americas. So my research has been focused on Beringia for the last 30 years or so. And it's important for the discussion in a couple of different ways. I think first, all, I would say, legitimate models of the peopling have people passing through Beringia, either along the coast or in the interior, but they came through here first. Second, interior Alaska arguably has the densest concentration of Pleistocene sites in all of the Americas, and it gives us unprecedented sort of control on sampling and understanding the broader lifeways. And this is a way to look at pre-adaptive baggage for some of the earliest Americans south of the ice sheets. That being said, if we listen to the media, which sometimes we can do, we might imagining that we're witnessing an overturning of everything that we thought we knew about the peopling of the Americas. Evidence has proven, or so we're told, that over 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, Native American ancestors sort of boated along southern Beringian coastlines, expanding using rather broad spectrum economic systems, regularly incorporating small mammals, fish, and birds in their life, rarely hunting megafauna, probably not hunting mammoth at all. All of this using tools perhaps derived from their Japanese predecessors. I think this perspective does not capture the actual evidence and the uncertainties involved, and many elements are just plain false. So my colleagues and I are in a position to comment, at least from a Beringian perspective, on what the record actually shows, what adaptations we actually see, what's the chronology, and the relationships with people further south. And I say we a lot in the talk. I want to acknowledge my collaborators. A lot of what I do is multidisciplinary. So geoarchaeologists like Josh Ruther, faunal specialists like Francois Leno, isotope specialists like Matt Wooler and Karin Hoffman, and then plain old archaeologists like Chuck Holmes and the rest. Any errors in the talk, of course, I'll take credit for myself. So moving on, hopefully the slide changed for everybody. Okay, so today I want to synthesize various areas where new data and analyses are changing or substantiating earlier ideas. And I'll cover the chronology of Beringian occupations, how these relate to a provisional model of cultural systematics. And we can examine these Beringian lifeways through intersite variability, the zooarc record, and recent stable isotope work that we've done. And this leads into new ideas about the importance of mammoth, particularly for early Paleo-Indian economies. I and my colleagues believe that mammoth were far more important in terms of subsistence and their impacts on mobility and landscape use of these early Paleo-Indians. And I'll trace this through new data in Siberia, Beringia, North America, and south of the ice sheets, including our work at Anzac 1. And finally, I want to compare these data to the rapidly growing archaeogenetic record, which establishes independent lines of evidence to evaluate these issues of the peopling of Northeast Asia and the Americas, which I view as the same thing. It's not just one. You have to look at the peopling and expansion post-LGM together. So to orient us, Beringia extends from the Verkhoyansk Range in modern Russia to the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice margins in North America. East Beringia encompasses present-day Alaska and Yukon. Central Beringia is largely under the Bering and Chukchi Seas, and Western Beringia includes both the Chukotka and Kamchatka peninsulas. I stress that the majority of Beringia is still above water, so we have plenty of avenues to examine early archaeological sites in the region. Over the past decades, my group and many others have discovered numerous Ice Age sites in eastern Beringia. Shown here on this map are our current totals, 96 cultural components, 64 of them between 14,000 and 11,500 cal BP, and everything I say will be in calibrated years BP, and additional 32 sites dating from 11,500 to 10,000 cal BP. The Bowling Alarid sites are shown as red, and the Younger Dryas and later shown in yellow. The inset shows the Tanana and Nenana River valleys, where I mainly work, that have yielded many sites dating to sort of pre-Clovis times and Clovis contemporary times, including Broken Mammoth, which we're analyzing now, Swan Point and Upward Sun River. And I've also included the 47 known sites along the ice-free corridor and the Northwest coast. And I want you guys to pay attention. Notice the absence of any sites along large stretches of the southern Beringian coast, even where we have isostatic rebound, where we have ancient shorelines raised above modern sea level. Of the earliest occupations in these regions ranged to about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Again, about 6,000 years after the earliest colonization. Extensive excavations, many of these multi-component sites generate a ton of data to evaluate technology, to evaluate subsistence, land use, habitat patterns, and the like. These are just some that I've investigated personally. Most have really well-preserved fauna and deeply buried stratified context. And we can use these sites to examine environmental change and human responses, particularly during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. The Delta River overlook site shown here exemplifies how well stratified many of these deeply buried sites are. Here we've got a 2.5 meter section allowing for stratigraphic separation. Those are actually uncalibrated dates on the side. So this ranges from 13,100 to about 2,000 years Cal BP, showing multiple components that we can really look at variation, not just single sites, but variation within these complexes through time. Many of the sites have minimal taphonomic disturbances. Here we see examples from 4 sites I've investigated. We can recover living surfaces, well-defined hearth features, activity areas, enabling us to analyze activities with clear association with radiocarbon dates and also with the lithic technology. So really a full picture of site structure and organization, which is sometimes rare in early sites. Beringian archaeologists have systematically surveyed many areas of Alaska, and we can generate a pretty robust chronology. These represent kernel density estimates for these various regions, and each component is represented by one average radiocarbon date. Sample sizes are relatively large, as you can see. And we see the first evidence of human occupation around 14,000 years ago, followed by an increase a little bit later, particularly during the later Alarid period, and it's shown in red, Bowling Alarid interstadial, followed by a decrease during the onset of the Younger Dryas, shown as blue, which is a cold and arid period we'll talk about a little bit later, followed by another increase in the early Holocene. And at least in this region, the Holocene thermal maximum is quite early. It's around 11,000 years ago. Northern Alaska, the ice-free corridors show later occupations. They don't get populated until about 13,000 years ago. The Northwest coast, only about 12,600. Interestingly, the renewed occupation in both the coast and the corridor occurred during that Younger Dryas decline. So I think there's a push-pull factor happening in population movements at the onset of the Younger Dryas, suggesting some outmigration. And this is consistent with the Zoark evidence we'll talk about in a little bit. A couple of purported early sites remain out there in the literature. I don't know how you guys feel about Bluefish Caves. It doesn't really, it's not really considered strong, compelling evidence here in Beringia. Bluefish Caves represents a handful of dated bones spanning about a 10,000-year period with possible cut marks, selected from over 32,000 bones from primarily carnivore-derived assemblages. None of them are directly linked with any of the lithic materials, which there's just a little bit of it, and they're morphologically, technologically similar to early Holocene materials in the region, probably after 7,000 years ago. And for those interested, Blong and Krasinski 2020 had a pretty good critique published in Paleoamerica. Those early dates, as I said, are rejected by most Beringian specialists. Now, there are a couple of lakes you guys may have heard of. Richard Vachela's look at paleofecal steroid biomarkers, arguing for maybe 34,000 years of human occupation. Again, those studies are not controlled for. They didn't look at the effects of omnivores like bears. And there's a number of issues that we do have a paper in review now, led by Helen McKay, where we're looking at steroid biomarkers in paleofecal studies. So hopefully that'll be out relatively soon to support that contention. So broadly, we've got really compelling evidence of unequivocal site occupation by about 14,000. It continues all the way to the present, highlighting the strength of robust recurrent patterns. And then we see those potential earlier sites that don't connect very well. And I suspect we're going to see similar things in North America south of the ice. Now, back in 2022, Chuck Holmes, myself, and Josh Ruther suggested a provisional chronology for these early occupations. And this has been elaborated by ourselves, along with Jeff Razik and others, in a paper that will be coming out in the Paleoamerican Odyssey conference. So later this year, the book, I guess, the proofs are already through, so the books will be available at the conference. And this is part of our contribution to that volume. Broadly, we consider 4 major periods. The first is dating to around 14,000 years ago. We term it the East Beringian tradition. And essentially, this is an expansion of Siberian Dyuktai culture into Eastern Beringia, into Alaska. It's characterized by Ubetsu technology, microblade cores, dihedral burins. Bifaciality is also present, as are organic tools, mostly made from mammoth ivory. This is very Asian, very Siberian. The second period is more amorphous, dating between 1309 and 1303. And this is roughly contemporaneous with sort of the mid-Moline, early Alarid period. This contains bifacial, unifacial, and some blade and microblade industries, as well as mammoth ivory tools. And we couldn't really link this with the later Chindadan complex, except for one find that we recovered at the Mead site, which is dating to 13,400, which does suggest that this period 2 is probably directly ancestral to the period 3 Chindadan complex that some of you may be familiar with. Also termed the Nana complex is another perspective on it. So the third period is linked with this Chindadan complex proper, associated with teardrop, straight-based and concave triangular bifacial points, mostly made on flakes, scraper planes, but also wedge-shaped microblade cores and burins. And you can see some examples from Healy Lake, Delta River Overlook, and Mead. So the microblades really don't go away. Everything has microblades up here. And then finally, the fourth period in the interior, at least, associated with the Denali tradition, dating between 12,900 and 11,500. And this roughly corresponds to the Younger Dryas. And we see remarkable regional diversification. Denali is widespread in interior Alaska, and by 10,000, it actually expands into the areas occupied previously by Northern Paleo-Indian tradition. And this includes convex-based points with random flaking, campus-type microblade cores, Donley burins, and in the interior, Chindadan and Denali materials overlap by about 900 years. And this suggests gradual replacement or in situ development. In North Alaska, we have a Northern Paleo-Indian tradition, includes Sluisway, Mesa. You may have heard of some of these complexes, and they're found somewhere between 12,300 and 11,500 calibrated years BP, but they disappear pretty soon after. So it's a little bit of an occupation during the Younger Dryas. Oh, I heard somebody say something. Okay, I'll continue. Sluiceway points are quite a bit larger, co-medially flaked. Mesa points are a little bit smaller with straight-based as opposed to convex-based, but there are some similarities. A lot of them share the same inscraper technology as well as gravers. Gravers do occur in Denali, but they're pretty rare. And then finally, we have the Northern Fluted Point Complex. It's definitely coterminous with these other two components. And this likely represents a northward migration through what now is a wide, expansive corridor along the Rockies and Brooks Range. And this follows Smith and Gable's 2018 analysis. We note, however, that microblade cores and blades are found in all of these traditions, Sluiceway, Northern Fluted, and Mesa, suggesting at least admixture with local groups. And then the Northwest Coast really only contains materials dating to this last period. And given the extent of deglaciation, which is widespread, people could have entered from the north, from the south, or through mountain passes to the east. And we can see these variously ascribed as Paleo-Marine, Kingi, Denali, Nenana, Northwest Coast biface tradition, Western stemmed. It runs the whole lot. Microblades are more common in the north and less common in the south. And more work certainly needs to be done on these Younger Dryas age occupations. So broadly, those are the sequences we find in Beringia proper, Eastern Beringia. So that segues into the next component of the talk today, which is what can we say about them? What can we say about the archaeology? These two photos, by the way, are from a project I did just north of Fairbanks, and they're found very different alpine and then low-lying muskeg-dominated black spruce forest, all within about 5 minutes of each other. So quite varied landscapes in Alaska. So we're going to be looking at adaptations, lifeways broadly. Our data really can give us a good understanding because we have so many sites. One of the richest concentrations, as I said, is in the Middle Tanana, which is what you're looking at here. Note the scale of 100 kilometers. We have 27 components dating to the Bowling Alarid, and 15 of them are pre-Clovis in age, like we'd expect. And our team and others have investigated a number of these, again, with well-preserved fauna to really help understand their overall lifeways. Broadly, there's a focus on bison and wapiti, and early there is a focus on mammoth. And these kinds of prey resources would have facilitated expansion eastward along rivers from western to eastern Beringia. And this does match our obsidian distribution analyses we published in 2017 for those interested that really show an east-west movement, very old movement of obsidian, very little on the coast, and that's only post 9,000 years ago, and it's limited to small areas of interior obsidian sources as well. Collectively, the adaptive strategies do not indicate coastal orientation, and we don't really see any coastal or maritime technology until many thousands of years later in the Middle Holocene throughout the region. Most of the sites are, as you see depicted here, and this is another collaboration with Eric Carlson at the Gristol River site. Most sites are logistically organized hunting camps along bluff tops along these major rivers, such as Gristol River. Large game like bison and elk dominate the record, along with biface and composite microblade weapons and processing tools. They really never go away up here until about, in the interior, probably about 700 to 900 years ago. So that's interesting. The Gristol River site was used in the fall, and collectively we do have all seasons represented. So we don't have really good evidence of transhumance, like some have argued, to the coast and back. They're here all periods, including the winter. So these are limited in the sense we have limited kinds of fauna associated with these, very specific to small time windows, but we do have evidence of residential sites. And sites like Upward Sun River, illustrated here, allow us to get a more complete picture of Beringian lifeways. USR dates to the Younger Dryas. This is a rigorous reconstruction of what are multiple households associated with this village, including a burial that was found in the central house here, or tent structure. 2 neonates and a 3-year-old child were interred that I'll talk about. Notice the fish processing, which we'll also talk about. So residential base camps provide a much richer record of paleo diet. At USR, again, we have 3 structures shown with the red dotted lines in plan view, and then the reconstruction, along with the cremation double infant in the one right here. Red polygons are hearths and blue dots are lithics. At this site, men, women, and children were likely present for an extended period. Our discovery of the anadromous salmon in multiple components pushed back the earliest human use of salmon in the Americas more than 3,000 years. Salmon were available and they were exploited what appears to be opportunistically. More broadly, of the 40 earliest components in Northwest North America, 90% are located in the deep interior and the vast majority along interior river bottomlands, indicating the importance of riverine resources to early foragers. Our faunal and stable isotope analyses indicate large mammal preference, but also small game like ground squirrel and hare. Compound-specific geochemical profiling of hearths, which we published in 2016, shows a lot of variation hearth by hearth, but broadly it suggests complexity in Denali subsistence. Averaging all of them together, resource use is roughly 53% terrestrial, 25% marine, which would be salmon, and 24% freshwater, which would be fish and waterfowl collectively in the summer occupation. And that's consistent with the ethnographic record as well. In 2020, my team published the first direct comprehensive paleo diet analysis of any Paleo-Indian, in this case, the mothers of USR1 and USR2 infants. We used multi-tissue stable isotope analyses. We used amino acid analysis and also serial analysis of the teeth to look at changes from earlier to later, so from spring to summer, basically. We found that summer protein diets are varied, with 40% of the diet composed of bison and elk, 32% of salmon, 22% of small terrestrial mammals and birds, and 6% of freshwater fish. Ancient, but note this is Younger Dryas. We'll talk about the earlier stuff later. Ancient Beringians at USR did not store salmon over winter like modern Dene peoples. Salmon were situationally exploited rather than harvested intensively and stored. And so these paleo diet models were successful. They fit squarely within the Zoark record. They felt they were positioned directly with the hearth analyses, good, consistent, independent lines of evidence consistent with the broader record. Now we moved on to look at the earliest fishing, particularly freshwater fishing in the Americas, and we were able to identify burbot and whitefish, which are common fish now exploited in the region, were also used in this Paleo-Indian period, primarily during the Younger Dryas. Here you can see as blue. but also as early as 13,000 years ago at the Mead site at the end of the Alarid Interstadial. Anadromous fishing was a little bit later. That occurred by at least 11,800 years ago. Faunal analyses indicate similar treatment. Likely they're caught in small numbers nearby. They were consumed on site. And again, no evidence of bulk processing or drying. New strontium analyses by one of my students, Crystal Glassburn, has shown that steppe bison in the region did not seasonally migrate long distances like caribou do, but they did modify their habitat by elevation. So in the summer, they'd be up in higher elevations. In the winter, they would go down to the lower valleys, bottoms. Megafaunal prey were thus available year-round within these East Beringian river systems, like the Tanana and the Yukon. And the humans focused on periglacial hunting of megafauna using technologies and strategies that persisted for a long time, for many millennia. When we expand to look at earlier assemblages, so this is all the way back to the beginning, we see an interesting trend. So this graph is illustrating faunal ubiquity, that is, percent occurrence of each taxa within each time period. The earliest period is shown in blue, the later Alloid in red, and then the Younger Dryas in yellow or orange. Broadly, megafauna like bison and elk are similar throughout all periods. They're very common. And if you go by edible biomass, of course, this would be the dominant prey, would be the bison and elk. However, colder, more arid areas or conditions like the Younger Dryas, they appear to be a stressor, a nutritional stressor. And so you see a widening of diet breadth, particularly of small mammals and fish. And we see more of that associated with that later period. What's striking is that mammoth is the most common taxa in the earliest assemblages. Fully 75% of our earliest faunal assemblages have mammoth, including 2 with post-crania, metatarsals at Mead Component 1, and 3 individuals at Swan Point Zone 4B with juvenile rib elements. So we can reject the idea that they're just scavenging ivory only. Horse is also represented only in this pre-13,300-year-old period, and again suggests an early focus on mammoth and horse in herbaceous tundra settings. And after their extinction, which occurs after that period shown in blue, people shift. They shift to more shrub tundra, gallery forest, and reliance on bison and elk, the remnant megafauna that haven't become extinct. And this pattern persisted again for many millennia during the Holocene. The fishing evidence, again, is an evidence for widening diet breadth during the stressor times of the Younger Dryas, very different than the earlier peoples. So overall, we can characterize these early Beringians as high-tech foragers, following Kelly and Todd, with high residential mobility and an emphasis on terrestrial megafauna. We observe some seasonal use of montane areas near glacial margins, and this adaptation is fully terrestrial. It is periglacial, and it does have similarities with the earliest widespread cultural manifestations south of the ice sheets, Clovis and fishtail fluted point traditions. Now, as a segue into the North American record, we have insights from 2 early burials in the Americas. The Clovis child buried at Anzick, Montana, dating to 12,900 years ago, and the ancient Beringian double infant burial shown illustrated here at Upward Sun River, or Hassanah. These also represent the 3 earliest Paleo-Indians with full genomic analyses in all of the Americas, these 3. In both burials, megafaunal weapon technology, including bifacial projectile points and organic foreshafts, were interred directly. This yields important insights into Paleo-Indian ideology, suggesting the cultural importance of megafaunal hunting to the peoples. Now, given our success with USR, we wanted to examine the only known Clovis individual that had some data remaining, and that was Anzick 1, using the same methods and protocols. As you know, the nature of Paleo-Indian subsistence is hotly debated, contested in the Americas south of the ice. To understand mode, tempo, and human ecology involved in the peopling, we need to understand subsistence and changes. Some have argued that Clovis were megafaunal specialists, focusing on mammoth. Others contend that this adaptation was not viable for various reasons, and thus they were broad-spectrum foragers, regularly incorporating small game, fish, and plants into their diet. Both models have extreme implications for mobility and technological organization. And there's opposing views on almost every data set, from the Zoark record all the way to modern lithic experimentation. Some remember the Metin Aaron and David Kilby competing papers a few years back. Yet all of these methods are secondary. They're indirect proxies for paleo diets. In contrast, the more direct evidence can be gleaned from stable isotope analyses on human tissue, on the remains of the individuals. In short, the foods we eat are incorporated into our tissues, including bones, and this involves the ratios of stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, carbon-13 and nitrogen-15. So the various ratios allow for identifying specific foods in our diet, and more importantly, for estimating proportions of those food that make up the contents. And these would be done through Bayesian analyses, mixing models. And we can estimate general diets. In other words, over the course of the bone modeling that is affecting this chemistry over longer periods of time, it's a general picture, which is better, more accurate than individual snapshots of what did they do at this particular site, at this particular season, that individual zooarc analyses of sites represent. So at Anzac, Anzac 1, most folks will probably know, was an 18-month male child found near Anzac, Montana. While he was reburied in 2014, there were several stable isotope measurements on bone collagen that was published, allowing for this analysis. Before we began, we had extensive consultation with local Native representatives from Crow and Blackfeet nations, as well as Sarah Anzac, the landowner, and all were and remain very supportive of the work that we did. So Jim Chatters and I were leads on the project. Jim at the time was working on Naya, a 13,000-year-old female from the Yucatan. We designed the research protocols and conducted the analyses. Matt Wooler produced the Bayesian dietary mixing model, and we had very support for analysis on site and comparative specimens in the region from Chris, Julie, and Stuart. So we published the study in December 24. We followed the same approach that we did for the Upward Sun River study. We triage the isotope data, use the 3 values whose averages are shown here at the top, with direct dates close to the site age that helps deal with potential contamination because there were some problematic dates. We then applied a nursing correction and a standard trophic discrimination factor to convert tissue values to diet values. And these represent overall protein diet of Anzac 1's mother. So that's the individual we're looking at. Of critical import was to select potential source taxa that are directly comparable to Anzac 1's mother. We collected data and in some cases ran new analyses ourselves on nearly 20 small and large herbivore and carnivore taxa with over 80 individuals analyzed. This was restricted to the same region, the Northern Great Plains, in the same period, the terminal Pleistocene. You have to do that. You can't go broad. You have to look at the overall food web for the region at the time. And to incorporate more secondary consumers, we included natural trap cave individuals, which is located very near Anzac, but we'd have to apply a transfer function for that. So we wanted 2 independent lines of evidence. 1, the suite of animal resources comprising the diet, and 2, the isotopic space of secondary consumers that we can compare with the Anzac 1 mother. And so here are the results of our Clovis era food web. Carbon ratios are on the x-axis and nitrogen ratios are on the y-axis, and you're looking for proximity. So carbon ratios and nitrogen ratios broadly show the herbivores and the carnivores where they should be. There's a trophic level increase for carnivores. The small mammals are depleted in both carbon and nitrogen. The secondary consumers are at the higher level. It's all making sense. We can make some predictions and some hypotheses for what Clovis diet could look like. They could cluster with bears as omnivores. They could cluster with wolves and American lions as mixed prey generalists, or with scimitar cat and dire wolf as megafaunal specialists. In fact, Anzac 1's mother plotted with the megafaunal specialist, most closely similar to Homotherium or scimitar cat. Her diet is equidistant, as you can see here, between mammoth and bison and elk. And really, when you look at the regional isospace, mammoth is the only animal that can be pulling that diet away from the other species. And I note small mammals are over here in green, quite far away, not making much of a pull at all on her diet. So using these data, we applied a Bayesian dietary mixing model to estimate relative proportions for her diet. The first model is based on taxa typically found in Clovis occupations. We found mammoth comprised nearly half of the diet. The second model introduced small mammals, and it didn't shift the results. Mammals maybe made up 4% or less of the overall protein diet, clearly inconsistent with the broad spectrum foraging hypothesis. The third model focused on a 4-source diet based on results in models 1 and 2. And in all three models, mammoth proportions are the highest compared to anything else. In human ecology terms, they were mammoth specialists. And of interest here is the high service, which we don't have a lot of elk in a lot of Clovis sites, faunal records, but we do actually have elk foreshafts directly with the burial at Anzac. And for those that know, wapiti or elk are coming down from the north. So it seems like that's a progress of species, both humans and wapiti, perhaps moving through the corridor. When comparing Anzac 1 mean source values to other secondary consumers, maternal diet is most similar to Homotherium, again, scimitar cat, which is a known juvenile mammoth specialist. The diet was very different to wolves and lions, Canis and Panthera, who had a broader mix of large, medium, and smaller size prey. We didn't have a directly comparable brown bear, but we did use a transfer function with Beringian bear data, and Anzac maternal diet was very different from an omnivore like bear. So we made several conclusions in the paper. We found strong megafaunal focus in Western Clovis. 96% of the protein diet was from megafauna, and most of that was from mammoth. And elk was significant, again, connected to those rods found at the site. Bison and camelids could not be separated isotopically, but bison are much more common in the Clovis record. So we suspect it's mostly bison. That's kind of a transitional species found in later populations, particularly Folsom. So, considering the hypothesis that mammoth hunting could play a key role in this whole business of the Paleo-Indian adaptations, the peopling of the Americas, I began to look broadly at the record, particularly the Siberian record. Earlier analyses of the Siberian record, and this was a paper by Ted Gable in 2002, showed a lot of variability. So here's a number of sites with the different species comprising it. And you can see that there's only a couple that really show mammoth use or heavy mammoth use. One is Velchia griva and Kokorevo 2. But I stress that these are found throughout Siberia, north, south, everywhere, and a pretty wide spread of dates. And it's also pretty old. So I wanted to look more recent record. So in Siberia, there are numerous sites with both mammoth accumulation and evidence for human use. The Siberian record has grown more recently, and now lots of sites have evidence for substantial mammoth exploitation. And they're shown in Western Siberia, Eastern Siberia, and Beringia, shown as yellow stars here, along a suggested route of colonization, which I'll talk about later in this talk. So again, this is consistent use, not only of large numbers. You can see the MNI ranges from 10 to over 200 individuals of mammoth, and I don't need to expound on how much meat and particularly fat are associated with this type of number, but also the percent NISP within the faunal record. So we're shooting 96 to 99% of the record is comprised of mammoth at multiple sites. We can see they're dominating both in percent NISP and MNI, and the age ranges span pretty much the entire late Upper Paleolithic, from 23,000, 27,000, all the way to about 12,000 years ago. And I'll touch on Lugovskoye, Yana, Beryok, and also Nikita Lake and Urez 22. And some of these are very recently described. We rarely have smoking guns, but I don't think it gets better than this, the Lugovskoye site. Zenin et al. Have reported on this famous example of successful mammoth hunting. Here we have a thoracic vert with a clear puncture wound from a composite microblade dart point, like those found at Swan Point. A microblade is still actually embedded in the remains. Reconstructions indicate kill at a distance of 8 meters with both the humans and mammoths standing in close proximity with a shallow angle of entry. And these, again, are the weapons used by Juktai populations and the earliest populations in Alaska. And I also stress that we do have unslotted osseous and lithic bifacial points found within these same systems. So it's not like there's only one. Moving to Western Beringia, Basalyan, Petulko, and others have shown that large mammoth accumulations at Yana and at Beryok follow a similar pattern. A few natural deaths before and after human occupation, but the bulk of the mammoths were killed by humans over the course of recurrent occupations. On the left chart, blue are the dates from the mammoth accumulation, and red are the associated cultural layers at the nearby Yana RHS site. Petulko et al. 2024 interpret these complexes to indicate human presence coinciding with the beginning of rapid accumulation of mammoth bones. They argue for human selection and transport of these remains from the massive mammoth accumulation zone into the occupation zone at the RHS site. And there was as many as 200 individuals at both sites. They interpret also low accumulation rates, not mass deaths based on the radiocarbon record, perhaps 1 to 2 mammoths a year. And again, this is recurrent use of particularly mammoth. Now, at URES 22 in Nikita Lake, we see a very similar pattern, which connects to the Americas. These two Siberian sites mirror the earliest material cultures in Alaska. If you remember period 1, which is East Beringian, and period 2 and 3, which are Chindadan. We've got early microblade tradition followed by Chindadan-like bifaces, separated by about a few hundred years, time transgressive from west to east, both associated with mammoth hunting. And again, mammoth hunting drops out at the end of the Chindadan period. In eastern Beringia, we have a record of mammoth use among the earliest occupations shown here in red at Swan Point, Broken Mammoth, Mead, Holtzman, McDonald Creek, and Gerstle River. And there's, again, exciting work from recent material at Mead and McDonald Creek that are going to be reported at the Paleoamerican Odyssey a little bit later this year. So briefly, this chart lists the directly dated mammoth remains or the occupations where mammoth have been found in the region. Blue dates are directly dated mammoth remains that date to the occupation. So they're contemporaneous and likely represent hunted mammoth. Red dates are dates that reflect scavenged mammoth tusks. So they're older. We've either directly dated them or they're found after the extinction of mammoth in the region. And we can basically see evidence of extreme active hunting or use of contemporary mammoth from about 14,200 to about 13,400 years ago. Again, this is all pre-Clovis. And some of these dates are the last known ages of mammoth in all of the Alaska mainland. Following this are a few thousand years of scavenging ivory tusk for tools. We don't find any postcrania in the sites that have the red work tusk. Again, another smoking gun, there's this postcrania, which are now found at 2 sites. And this is what some of that material looks like. So the broken mammoth, with the exception of 1, likely dates to the occupation, as does the Holtzman rod. The Gerstle River point below was definitely scavenged. It's found in a 10,000-year-old site, about 3,000 years after their extinction. So work led by Matt Wooler and Audrey Rowe on mammoth mobility, this is all recent work, showed that they had core areas of preferred habitat based on aerial strontium and oxygen analyses, serial strontium and oxygen analyses of tusks. They had preferred habitats. They weren't everywhere. They had certain areas they were concentrating, and they're shown to the right in purple. Interestingly, these are the areas that are preferentially inhabited by the earliest Alaskans as well. And we do have lots of surveys sort of throughout the Alaskan record, at least, to show that that's the area they were concentrating during pre-Clovis times. We also have recent data from Luciano Prates and Ivan Perez in South America showing that fishtail fluted point concentrations are closely connected to megafaunal dense areas or megafaunal rich areas. Yeah, I can't say more about that right now. This brings us to a proposed model of mammoth use. The most recent Neotoma database shows the distribution of woolly mammoth in green, present not only in Beringia, but through the ice-free corridor and into your region as well, or at least a little bit south of where you guys are at. And Columbian mammoth are shown in purple that are further south. The ancestors of the first Americans, Siberian late Upper Paleolithic peoples, regularly exploited mammoth. They understood their habitat preference, seasonal mobility patterns, and they used effective long-distance weaponry to kill and to select prime adult mammoths. They also used mammoth as food as well as raw materials for their technology. This adaptation, in part, allowed for high residential mobility and rapid expansion from southern Siberia northward to Beringia, regardless of local resource variation. Woolly mammoth exploited periglacial environments particularly, and this could allow movement through an emerging ice-free corridor where a corridor of good habitat remained. Steppe bison were common along receding glacial margins in both Beringia and North America, south of the ice sheets as well. Wang et al. 2020 produced this mammoth habitat suitability model, and again, consistent with this hypothesis. The earliest widespread cultural manifestations south of the ice sheets, Clovis in North America regularly exploited large megafauna, and in particularly mammoth. They likely exploited both woolly and Columbian mammoth, the latter becoming the most common element in their diet, as can be seen from Anzac. Climate-related breakup of mammoth steppe patches reduced habitat, making them more susceptible to human hunting pressure. In the north, this was polutification associated with the emerging boreal forest, and particularly wetland formation and lake formation. Mammoth become extinct by 13,400 in Alaska. Later Beringian cultures diversified. They shifted. We had multiple kinds of populations going after different types of species, particularly bison and elk in the interior. Mammoth became extinct later in North America by 12,800, and the latest individuals are associated with Clovis sites. These populations too shifted to other megafauna like bison, and we see cultural diversification in both areas. So that sort of sums up some ideas from the Beringian record and examples of mammoth exploitation. And so for the last part of the talk, I wanted to shift to how can we use these to address the various peopling models out there? How do the genetic data sort of point towards a series of patterns that we can then test against this record? And so the past decade, I've been looking at this. Actually, it's been over 10 years now. There's lots of debate, but there is emerging consensus. And I want to stress that a lot of the patterns I'm going to talk about have been produced, some of them as early as 2014, some as late as 2025, but they're consistent. They're not overturned. They're just enriched with more data. So over the past few years, I've been involved in a number of collaborative endeavors, working with both geneticists and paleoecologists, and some of the resulting publications are shown here. In one of these, my colleagues and I discussed the emerging convergence of both lines of evidence. We argued that we should strengthen our models by more close collaborative work, learning from each other. Recent genomic research really can help elucidate prehistoric adaptations, resource use, and biogeographic expansions. And we focused on developing models addressing one overlapping elements, that is anchor points, representing genetic populations at specific geographic locations associated with material culture that we can identify more broadly beyond that sample. And second, the timing of lineage divergence and demic expansion in the region, and over 50 of them are greater than 9,000 years old, and most have been published in the last 5 years. So we'll begin with a very simplified version of the ancient populations we're going to talk about. This has been, I think, the biggest surprise to archaeologists is that we really had no ability to discern various metapopulations on the basis of material culture alone. So for example, Anzic and Spirit Cave are very closely related genetically, but yet the technology is very different. Of course, one is pre-Younger Dryas and one is during the Younger Dryas. These patterns are uncontroversial. These were replicated by dozens of studies since 2018. We see calibrated years before present. You also see the LGM, or the last glacial maximum. So please keep these in mind when we consider these various groups. So all modern and ancient Native Americans derive from a single founding population, termed First Americans. And that's one of the results in our 2018 Nature paper. They diverged from East Asians, ancient East Asians, about 36,000 years ago, but they had strong gene flow until about 25,000 years ago. And that's when we see the last divergence between them. About 25% of Native American genes derive from a separate source termed Ancient North Eurasians, or A&E, and this occurred sometime between 24,000 and 20,000 years ago. Surprisingly, there's strong early structure among Native Americans with 3 basal groups: ancient Beringians, which remained in Alaska, and 2 groups of Native Americans, North Native Americans and South Native Americans, NNA and SNA. In a 2016 paper, 2 different Siberian groups were identified: Paleo-Siberians, who separated from Native American ancestors about 24,000 years ago, but remained in Siberia, where they were largely replaced by later Neo-Siberian reindeer herders late in the Holocene. And these latter are more closely related to East Asians like the Han Chinese. And these Paleo-Siberians cluster with Paleo-Inuit and are likely the source of this later spread for Paleo-Inuit peoples expanding into the Arctic after 5,000 years ago. So while genetic analyses are great at identifying groups and split times, they're less suitable for identifying geographic locations for these groups through time, because obviously they're going to change, and you can't rely on modern groups. A lot of early studies did this in the early 2000s. They just relied on modern samples. So you need those anchors, genetic anchors. So in the last few years, we have developed a wide variety of dated individuals that we can connect with these groups. And you can see them as yellow stars here. You can see the main issue is we would love to have human remains in this neck of the woods. We need them prior to Anzick. Anzick is, in fact, the oldest Native American that we've got, and that's 13,000 years old or so. So where were they in earlier periods becomes a little bit more problematic, and so there's disagreement. In the last few years, however, we have new finds to fill this gap, and I just pointed them out there. Uskatkaya near Lake Baikal dates to 14,000 years ago, and Kyrgos 1 in the Lena Basin dates to 17,000. These individuals are the closest cousins to Native Americans, again suggesting the FAM formation and location was in southern Beringia or southern Siberia, not northward in Beringia, because that's where these samples are located. One more recent discovery, the genomic analyses of 12 Jamon individuals definitively show that Jamon ancestors are not closely related with Native Americans. Also, Jamon had no connection with ancient North Eurasians, and thus I think we can rule out Japan as a source for the first Americans. The most important genetic results bear on the timing of colonization, and these are the age estimates of lineage diversification. So effective population expanses and split times within the lineages help us sort of narrow that down. So here are the references that are used to build this particular model. And again, they're pretty consistent. Gusareva et al. 2025 is still using the data or consistent with the data from 2018, several years earlier. None of these ranges are controversial. So the mitochondrial DNA show a huge female population increase somewhere between 16 and 13,000 years ago, along with increasing haplogroup diversity. And this is a strong indication of migration into the Americas. Y-DNA along paternal lines indicate an upper limit for human entry after somewhere between 15,300 and 14,300 years ago. Autosomal data, which you're getting from both your maternal and paternal lines, indicate ranges for splits between those basal first Americans about 20,000 years ago for ancient Beringians, somewhere between 17 and 14,000 years ago for NNA to SNA, and then various split times within SNA. And I should say SNA is the only group that's really south of the ice until much later in time. Since NNA, again, is restricted to the north, the diversification within SNA is the critical issue. And so a number of papers have indicated that SNA expanded in a rapid star-like radiation, consistent with a colonization event south of the ice sheets. Sikora et al. Estimate this divergence occurred between North and South Americans between 14,900 and 13,200, so around 14,000 years ago. That's really consistent with the archaeology. I consider this date range to be the best estimate for the expansion of SNA within North America. And again, it's consistent with either an ice-free corridor or a Pacific coastal route. South America versus Central America is a good indicator for when South America was populated, and that was sometime between 14,800 and 12,800, averaging around 13,000, which is really consistent with that expansion of fluted fishtail projectile point complex sites. So this is the broad range that we're going to talk about with the final section, which is going to be to develop a model for you that partially was published in 2023. So this is the map projection we're going to use to integrate the genetic and archaeological data. The stars are those individuals where we have data for their genomics. The splotches of color will be the estimated extent based on later or earlier individuals, as well as the broader region in various colors. And then the archaeological traditions will be shown in blue where we have them. It's unfortunately for some of the very earliest remains, we don't have great connections with the archaeology per se. So this was a warm, relatively wet period during MIS3, the last major interstadial. Tianyuan is a basal East Asian ancestor, or AEA. A few thousand years later, we see the emergence of a new population that began to diverge, and that's the Native Americans, or First Americans. Another very different population was present to the north, termed Ancient North Eurasian. This group is linked with Yana and later Malta and Afontova-Gara individuals, all in Siberia, and all of them are linked with the Siberian Middle Upper Paleolithic. Again, this is the warmest part of this last interstadial. We can imagine an expansion north as you've got relatively ameliorating conditions. We have another couple of individuals 33,000 years ago in East Asia. We have the AR33K individual, which shows continued expression of East Asians in that region in the Amur. And this will continue from 33,000 all the way into the Holocene. So they're definitely in situ. It doesn't look like they're moving until much later in time. Yeah, so because we don't have individuals from FAM, where are they located? Well, it's probably somewhere in Transbaikal. The salt pit individual you can see here is 75% AEA and 25% A&E, and that's consistent with its location in space. There are some ideas for very early sites like Chiquahita Cave in Mexico and Hartley Mammoth. I think we have dispensed with the Chiquahita Cave geofacts in an article we published 2022. And Hartley Mammoth, I think, also has potential issues we can talk about if there's interest later on. But there's no reason to expect humans in the Americas at this time, certainly not first American ancestors. So between 24 and 20,000 years ago, there's a number of important genetic events, but we don't have a ton of samples for that specific period, but we have some on either side that help inform us. We have on Fontova and Amur River individuals after this period showing continued location for A&E and AEA in both of those reasons. The reason for this depopulation of the far north appears to be the onset of MIS2 stadial, particularly the last glacial maximum between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago. The regional climate was arid, it was frigid. It appears that hunter-gatherers had a more difficult time. These conditions probably caused or exacerbated genetic splits as people congregated in separate resource-rich areas in the south with reduced mobility. All of this can facilitate genetic isolation. The first Americans we know were genetically isolated from East Asians at this time, marking this beginning of the standstill, so-called standstill. They did, however, admix with ancient North Eurasians between 24 and 20,000 years ago, suggesting they're still in southern Siberia because A&E were never anywhere else, as far as we can tell. At the same time, Paleo-Siberians, marked as APS in yellow, diverged from East Asians and also admixed with A&E groups. So white sands, which we may talk about later, purportedly dates to this period. If it does represent a valid site, which is unclear, the occupants are unlikely to be Native American relatives more closely. If we had to guess, perhaps they could be associated with an earlier ancient North Eurasian spread, because they really, given that both quarters were closed at this point, they would have had to come through somewhere in the neighborhood of 29 to 30,000 years ago. And that would be consistent perhaps with the Yana migration north. So lots of question marks on this one. So the period between 20 and 16 is really the contention between various authors. The most recent common ancestor for all major mtDNA haplogroups are forming during this period. I want to stress this. We mentioned this in 2018. All that is required genetically is that first Americans were isolated from other East Asian populations. It says nothing about where they could be isolated, just they're not right next to them. So there's lots of hypothetical locations. You can see here some that I've analyzed, John Hofecker, Villerslev, Ian Bouvet, and others. So there's a lot of variety of interpretations. I suspect that it's in Transbaikal for a number of different reasons. One, you can see the Kygros 1 individual, about 17,000 years old, associated with a very close relative of first Americans in southern Siberia. I think they were either in Transbaikal or the Upper Aldan. And the second reason I think this is the case is because we have the presence of the Juktai culture. This Juktai culture is clearly earlier in southern Siberia. It clearly expands north at exactly the same time you start seeing the first people at Urez 22, Nikita Lake in western Siberia, and Swan Point in eastern Siberia. AR19K, Kygros 1, and Afantagova Gara 3 secure the geographic locations of East Asians, Paleo-Siberians, and remnant A&E populations, respectively. And again, ecologically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be expanding northward during the LGM. It makes sense that this would happen later. Ecologically, I suspect it happened somewhere between 16 and 14, and I think this would make relatively most people not unhappy if you like Paisley Caves or you like Monteverde or you like Cooper's Ferry as legitimate, or at least where the material culture is directly connected to radiocarbon dates. Um, so the climate is ameliorating. We've got expansion of moose along with what we think humans associated with the Juktai. It's consistent with the mtDNA data and the Y-DNA data showing a major diversification, and with mtDNA, a female effective population size expansion. So this does track with our data for expanding Juktai populations. And I point out that the earliest site in Alaska, basically the earliest site in this whole region, Swan Point, is clearly connected to this Juktai material culture, particularly with Ubetsu, very specific type of microcore production. I think the best model for entry is between 15,300 and 14,300, and that matches the Y-DNA, which is the best constraint we have. The NNA SNA group went through first, since they continued south, followed by ancient Beringians who remained in Beringia. And we see again the first evidence at Swan Point. NNA and SNA likely split the millennia or so before Clovis. The constricted geographic corridors of the ice free corridor and northwest coast provide excellent boundary mechanisms to disrupt gene flow and facilitate the divergence of these groups. And Grugny et al. 2019 made a similar argument. I suspect both routes were used, but by different populations. SNA through the interior and NNA along the coast. The difference is the SNA group expanded throughout the rest of the Americas, while the NNA group remained in the northwest coast until later. And this fits with our first genetic anchor points only a few hundred years later. So the Anzic child is clearly part of Clovis, as well as a sublineage of SNA, meta population that's ancestral to all Native Americans in the South, which it's not just South America, but all of North America, except for the far north. Ancient Beringians likely entered Eastern Beringia because we see the first links to material culture on both sides with this Chindadan complex and later Denali groups. Clovis and fishtail fluted points are the first and only continent-wide cultures. This really does match rapid star-like radiation, where you're seeing them with relatively homogeneous toolkits over wide stretches of space. And this is also the last period of mammoth hunting in Beringia. Between 12,900 and 10,000 years ago, we have a lot more anchor points, which is why I used these to generate that earlier model. Genetics from Shukaka in Alaska showed that NNA groups were in the Northwest Coast very early, and they remained there with multiple individuals all the way to the present, associated with modern Salishan, Penutian, Wakashan individuals or groups later. Since Spirit Cave is closely related to Anzic, both are SNA, and later Kennewick has considerable SNA admixture. They provide a good boundary for the distribution between these two around 9,000 years ago. Upper Sun River, Trail Creek show ancient Beringians were in Alaska, directly associated with the widespread Denali complex shown in red here. Wedge-shaped microblade cores continue to be made on the American side while they're being replaced on the Siberian side by this expanding Sumnagan culture shown as yellow. We have many individuals now from this Sumnagan, Sialak, Belkachi material cultural tradition on the Siberian side, and all of them are very closely related, and they're directly associated with this APS or ancient Paleo-Siberian cluster. Radically different technology, conical cores, pencil cores, near absence of bifacial implements. These populations and the later Siberian Neolithic are directly linked with ancient Paleo-Siberians almost until the present. So Chukchi, Koryak, as well as Paleo-Inuit, Inuit, Yupik, and also Aleut populations. So broadly, I'd like to close by considering some implications of these patterns. First, glacial and post-glacial climate change appears to be the major driver of human population history in the region. This history of migration, of admixture, and depopulation was likely conditioned through regional environmental effects and the success or failure of human adaptive strategies. In particular, mammoth hunting after the LGM allowed for high residential mobility, facilitating rapid expansion into new areas using similar technology and subsistence strategies. You're mapping onto the animal, which is widespread and tracks widely, rather than mapping onto the place, which is much more, would lead to diversification quite early. The loss of mammoth in both Beringia and North America south of the ice resulted, the ice sheets, resulted in regional diversification, both of technologies and also of diets. Second, the emerging genetic consensus is coalescing with the archaeological records of these regions in ways that I think make sense. The model that I presented here and published in 2023 does offer opportunities for continued testing. And that's sort of the way I think about this is we need more models, not less. So I don't want to reject any of the models that are out there, and we just need to test them with future data, both on the archaeology side as well as the genetic side. And so there was limited expansion in North Siberia during the warm MIS-3 interstadial, but there does seem to be a retraction south during MIS-2, during the LGM. And the peopling of the Americas seem to be connected with this ameliorating conditions associated with deglaciation after 16,000 years ago. It was a time transgressive process. I expect 16,000 years. They're in Western Siberia, entering Alaska maybe by 15,000, and through the ice-free quarter by perhaps 14,000 years or so. Humans using technologies and strategies associated with high mobility and megafaunal hunting, particularly mammoth, expanded into Northeast Asia and ultimately peopled the Americas. So thank you for your attention. And I'd like to acknowledge the funding my team has received over the years through NSF, National Park Service, BLM, Army Corps of Engineers, my collaborators, regional and local native groups, particularly the Healy Lake Tribal Council, who I've worked with to work on the Upward Sun River individuals. I'm very appreciative of their support, and the Tanana Chiefs Conference, which is our regional nonprofit native group for the Tanana. And then, of course, our field researchers that prior to COVID, we did a lot of this work pre-COVID, resulted in the analyses you've seen today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben. This is fascinating stuff, and really great to see everything kind of coming together. And it leads to lots of questions. I feel like there's probably more questions than there are answers per se, but
I'm
there's still a
happy to
lot.
take any and all questions.